Generosity New York is a group of Christians spurring on one another to experience philanthropy differently. With more joy, more wisdom, and doing it in community, which is rare. We deliver events, content, and counsel. Events that are inspirational, educational, and safe. Not meant for solicitation. This is meant for learning and being inspired around your own generosity.
Well, I'm going to get us started as more people arrive, just to make the most of our time today and to honor your time. My name is Tim Vickers, and I'm one of the directors for Generosity New York. And just as a reminder, we're gathering weekly, not just for great information, but to continue to spur each other on in generosity and to inspire each other, to make a difference and to be thoughtful about the gifts and the resources and the opportunities that God's given us. And we also want to have some fun and check in and encourage each other too. So super excited about what we get to talk about today. And I would just like to open up our time with a verse that was on my heart. It's actually 3 verses from 1 John chapter 3. I think it's appropriate given that today is Good Friday. So this is what it says. It says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for ours. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth." And so I hope that, we all have a chance to reflect on the power of the cross today. How it's transformed our lives and, through an awesome sacrifice and incredibly generous act of love. And I think today, as we talk about our response to the COVID crisis and the opportunities that we have to make a difference with what we've been given, both in the immediate term and the midterm and the far term, I hope that that these types of thoughts will guide that. And I think it's super appropriate that we kind of frame this time, with a bias towards loving action, as we talk about, and as we hear from Ali and Ishita, as they share their perspective and what they've been learning as they've been deep into this for the last few weeks, in terms of the opportunities that are out there, both philanthropic and impact investing wise. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to Ali and Ishita. One's an older friend, one's a newer friend. Hi, Ishita. Good to see you. And, I'll start with Ali, who has been involved with Generosity New York for a few years now. And I got to know her when we hosted I got to know her pretty well in Big Sky, Montana, for a ski weekend where we hosted a journey of generosity. So not a bad place to talk about biblical generosity. But one thing that was really clear is that she's got a passion, for making a difference in this world. And she, this last year, made a career change, so that her career kind of lined up better with her worldview and what God was calling her to. So she is an advisor at Align Impact. And there she helps clients build full spectrum, bespoke financial strategies to move the needle on the social and environmental issues that they really care about. She also sits on the board of a group called Together LA, and they're a behind the scenes force focused on following God's work and supporting that work in the Los Angeles community to further catalyze the impact of ministry workers and churches all over the city. Prior to Align, she spent time selling pharmaceuticals and medical devices at both Eli Lilly and Stryker. And she also has spent time in the philanthropic world, building out communities such as Switch, which is an anti-trafficking agency that she started in South Carolina in 2012, which is still operating today. And she also helped start a group called The Marketplace, a community of about 300 to 400 influential professionals in LA who met monthly to network and to listen to speakers talk about business, social impact, and faith issues. Ishita is our new friend. So Ali's on the West Coast in LA, and Ishita's in Brooklyn. She's also an advisor at Align, and she also helps clients identify and implement strategies. But she also has a focus on the philanthropic world in addition to the impact investing world. Prior to joining Align, she was an independent consultant. She spearheaded strategy and process development for venture philanthropy at New Schools Venture Fund and fundraising at Mind Research Institute. Her experience in the education sector spans the advancement of New Classroom's personalized learning model as chief of staff. She did strategy consulting at Huron, and she's an alumnus of Education Pioneers. She started her career at Bloomberg, and between Bloomberg and her entrance into social impact professionally, Ishita went to Duke's Fuqua School of Business, where she earned her MBA with a concentration in social entrepreneurship. She also mentioned her favorite quarantine hobby right now is winning at 2-player board games. I'm not sure that that's her husband's favorite hobby right now, but Ali and Ishita, welcome. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and insight with us today. And the floor is now yours. Please welcome Ali and Ishita.
Awesome, Tim. Thank you so much for having us. It's great to see all of you. I am going to share my screen. Cool. Well, thank you so much for hosting us today. It's to get to spend some time with you all, and I hope that you find our conversation enriching, challenging, but also full of hope in a time where that is sometimes hard to find. Tim, thanks for the background. I'll give a bit more background on myself and then pass it to Ishita, and then we will get started. So as Tim mentioned, I've known Jeff and Tim for a little while now. I got introduced to them a few years ago and then got invited on a trip to Montana to go through Journey of Generosity with Tim and 7 or 8 other 20s and 30s. And we also had one of the initial conversations around Gen Collective and casting vision for that. I live in Los Angeles, like I mentioned, so unfortunately I can't be as involved in Gen Collective or get on your calls on Friday mornings at 8 a.m. your time and 5 a.m. my time. So I can't be involved as I would like, but I love Generosity New York and the collective and the conversations you guys are having as a community. So a bit more about my background. I'm not going to read my whole bio as Tim just did, but I'd love to share a bit about my why. So I've always had 2 parallels in my world. One being my career. I've worked at a couple large healthcare organizations, and one being my impact work. As Tim mentioned, I started an anti-trafficking organization. I started a faith and work community in LA, and I've also had more just sort of like love your neighbor work, where I met this mom and her 7 kids on the streets when I lived in Indianapolis, and ended up spending 2 years with them as they transitioned through government subsidized housing and shelters for victims of domestic violence, and really got to understand some of the struggles and challenges of an uneducated family who was in poverty. So a few years ago, I went through this long several month period where I was really asking myself hard questions around my faith and the church and myself. And one of the big takeaways from that season for me was, as I looked at my life and where I felt most alive and where I felt like God most used me, it was often as a bridge between communities. Often between communities of people with great privilege and access to opportunities, and those without less opportunity. So I felt like it was time to integrate my skill set and my passion, and here I am, working at an impact investing firm where I get to make those connections every day. Ishita, do you want to give a little bit about your why?
Yeah, and thanks, Tim, so much for having us both here today and also introducing me in a way that is better than how I would introduce myself. So appreciated that greatly. A little bit more about myself personally. I think my own path into impact investing, and a big reason of why I'm so drawn to mission-driven organizations, is my own family, my parents, and much of my extended family is now in the US and had emigrated from India to the US in the 1980s. And many of the types of organizations that we'll speak about today that help with community development and helping those who don't have access to capital were really the reasons that my family was able to survive and do well in the US. And I think without some of those opportunities, I wouldn't really be here today. And so, that really propels me to want to contribute to not only my own community broadly across those who can't access capital, but also I was born and raised in New Jersey. I live in New York now, and my own community is partially people of Indian ethnicity, but also partially those who live in the tri-state area. And so I think a big piece of why I'm really excited about this conversation is I'm very excited to be part of this, part of this movement that can really help the coronavirus relief in this tri-state area as we're hit pretty hard.
Awesome, thank you. Can you guys hear me, or I guess Tim, can you confirm? Ishita was breaking up a bit, and I don't know if it's or.
Yes, we can hear you great.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for the confirmation. Don't get too much feedback on a webinar where everyone is muted. Cool, thanks Ishita. Just a quick background on Align and what we do there before we move into the meat of what we want to talk about today. Align is an impact investment advisory firm, and currently we work with about 45 clients, individuals, families, and foundations to build customized financial portfolios that help them positively change the social and environmental issues that they care most about. So typically we focus on every impact sector you can think of, but we've spent the last month really honed in on COVID. It's been a real privilege because most of our clients are saying, hey, we have all these impact goals and we want to set them over here for now and focus on what's right in front of us. So I feel really grateful to be doing work that feels meaningful right now. And it's easy to be bogged down with the anxiety that is all around us at all times, but seeing and getting to know organizations that are stepping into some of these gaps is filling me with hope and making me feel a little bit less helpless. So I am hopeful, we are hopeful that this conversation does the same for you. Awesome. So we will send out a copy of the deck at the end of this. So don't feel the need to read every word on every slide. We're going to give you overview of many organizations. And if you have any questions, I think Kristen and Tim are both monitoring the chat room. So send them there. So if anyone would be willing to unmute, we wanted to sort of understand where you guys are at first in thinking about philanthropic response to this crisis. So if anyone would be willing to answer, we'd love to hear how you've engaged generously during this time and what challenges you've come across in your philanthropic giving, or I know some of you are involved with impact investing.
I would say, this is John Stanley, I'd say the primary as far as giving has been really checking in on most of the ministries I work closely with, and making sure that there's stability in the midst of this. In other words, what has been their biggest needs, not only to pray for, but just crisis needs, financial bridging, payrolls, things like that.
Awesome.
This is David Metcalf. How you doing? I'm actually down in Florida, but I got a call at 5:30 in the morning, maybe 2 Mondays ago, and it was from a former student at University of Central Florida that's at Mount Sinai saying, help me, I have to build a BiPAP machine that can serve 2 patients at Mount Sinai there in New York. And it was not so much they needed money, it's Mount Sinai, but they needed time, talent, and treasure all together, kind of a response where they said, okay, I know 5 pressure vessel experts at NASA Kennedy Space Center. I can get you connected with them. Here's supply stores that are still open right now that have some of the parts you'll need for flow metering and other stuff like that too. So it's not always just about the money is the point I was going to make, but it's also sometimes about what else you can contribute to, like you kind of said, make a difference to and have an impact. So my role was mostly just to network and pull different people that didn't know each other together and help them with some of the solutions that you saw too. that Mount Sinai was really taking the charge on too, as global leaders.
It's really cool. It's really cool.
I suppose in the theme of it's not always about money, we've taken in a young lady whose mom is a nurse practitioner. So she is living with our family and has been for over a month already, so that her mom can focus on serving without worrying about leaving her young daughter at home and bringing home the virus.
That's awesome. We'll take maybe one more or two more if anyone else wanted to share.
Sure. I've sit on the board of a nonprofit that is just launching a new group. They're a global nonprofit, but they have local chapters in different cities, and we're launching in Brooklyn right now, and they're setting up a food bank in what is a food desert in East Brooklyn with a very vulnerable population. So working on that, fundraising around that, giving money to that.
Awesome.
So, this is Paul Del Sandro in Arizona right now. I was on a call with, it was a call with Stanford, and they had the person who runs the Fidelity Fund, DAF, and also some other folks. And basically what the Silicon Valley Nonprofit Foundation, and what they said is that the nonprofit foundation in Silicon Valley has gotten a ton of requests, and they've really doubled down and increased their giving for all the nonprofits in the Bay Area that they serve. And they can't keep up with the demand. And on the DAF side, what they were told is that the giving has increased 35% from the DAFs around the country. So people are digging down and doing more. So, and also the other piece is there's some amazing tax advantages now for charities under the CARES Act, like 100% of AGI, which will help nonprofits.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And it's beautiful to see people really rise to the moment who are able to. So thank you all for sharing those examples. It's an inspiring way to start our conversation. So is she just going to jump into some sort of general ways to think about giving and investing during this time, and a framework to use as a lens to think about immediate, mid, and long-term relief for COVID? Ishita, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and thank you all for sharing. I think that some of our general recommendations are very spot on with what you are all sharing in terms of actions you've already taken. And so our first and foremost, our biggest thing is your existing network, your existing grantees. Work with those people to really understand their needs. It doesn't have to be just from a funding perspective, but from the funding perspective, what does their cash runway look like? And have they had to lay off people, or are they on the brink of needing to lay people off? And maybe there's some sort of bridge funding that can be offered there to really help them keep and retain the staff that they have. Are they facing some sort of an increased demand in some of their services that they provide, or do they have to halt all of the business operations? And where can you either offer some sort of connection to somebody else who can help, or some funding support? So I think really just having that conversation with existing grantees and people within your most immediate network is the low-hanging fruit that we see to really offer help. And then looking a little bit beyond that, what are some of the local organizations that you either go to yourself that you don't want to see really, fall and collapse as a business? Or what are some of the local hospitals, local food banks that you can give to? And so something that we've been thinking about a lot with some of our own clients is, in their own communities, are there hospitals that are seeing a greater need for the number of hospital beds, or anything that they need in terms of food. So really just looking at your local community and your existing grantees and partners is what we would say are like the most effective ways. We feel like if everyone did a little bit of that, there could be a greater macroscopic change that can happen. And then for the way we are framing the solutions here, with coronavirus, as you all know, things are evolving so rapidly. There are known challenges, and then what we see is that there are also so many unknowns in the long term. So while we may usually think of short term as the next year, I think in the environment of coronavirus, we're really seeing the immediate term as the next week and a half, and then the midterm as the next 3 months, and the long term, and what we really see as like many of the unknowns as beyond 3 months from now. And we're using this sort of framing to really build out what are the different types of solutions and some of the goals involved in those time periods. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive necessarily, but it does help provide a little bit of better structure in how you can really address the types of ways you want to benefit your local community or society. And so the first one we have here is immediate term. Some of these examples are really offering like aid and relief that is sometimes very individualized or to smaller organizations. And that can be anything from healthcare workers to food banks, offering funding to homeless shelters and other organizations that are helping homeless people in marginalized communities. And the bigger goal of this is really just immediate relief to those who are most at risk through their health and the quality of their life. And then looking at more so what we're seeing as the midterm is how can we support the small businesses? Right now, many of those are closed down for the next month or so, but we don't know how long exactly that will go on for. So it's really pulling from what we just spoke about previously of asking your existing grantees what they need, but then also looking beyond that, because yes, there are many funders in New York and in San Francisco, but looking maybe more broadly at the US and other areas that don't necessarily have the group of funders who would be able to contribute, and maybe even more broadly than that, internationally to emerging markets where coronavirus has not fully hit yet and there may be a month or two behind, and looking at pooled funds and how we can support small businesses in that 2 week to 3 month period. And then looking at the long term, I mean, this is really, I know, probably not on anyone's mind at this moment, but it's good to at least think through this right now in terms of what are the types of research, systems, development, infrastructure that can be funded and supported to really prevent some of the challenges that we have faced today with coronavirus, if something like this were to occur again, or something even a little bit different, but still something that is affecting the world altogether. So I'll pause there because we definitely want this to be interactive. So if anyone has any questions on how we're thinking of this framing. Great. So if no one has questions, we'll go ahead and start. We'll go ahead and start, and we'll jump into some spotlight organizations for the immediate term, and then we'll jump into midterm after that.
Awesome, thank you, Ishita. Yeah, I think one thing to point out on this framework is a lot of immediate term opportunities are primarily philanthropic. Because as you think about it, like Ishita said, A lot of it is providing services. And I was joking with Tim yesterday, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Immediate term is like that, those bottom level needs that are incredibly important, but also often are given to people who wouldn't be able to repay. And then as we talk more about midterm opportunities, there are a handful of investment opportunities that Ishita's gonna talk about. So with immediate needs, something that I have found myself asking as I look at different organizations and think about ways to step into some of these gaps is this a new vulnerability, or is crisis simply shining a brighter light on a vulnerability or inequity that already existed? And that's been really an interesting concept for me to wrestle through, and kind of humbling and like convicting at the same time for me to think through that lens versus just like, oh, I want to like put all my resources behind this right now, but instead thinking like, what did this look like before, and how is this particular area going to be really affected in this moment of crisis? So unsurprisingly, one of the most immediate needs is food for people who don't have access to food. Well, I, or probably most of you, are able to stock up on groceries that will last for months, or toilet paper that will last for months. People who live paycheck to paycheck or in poverty can't do that. And not to mention, when they do get money for food, often shelves in the grocery stores are already empty based on the hoarding culture that we're in right now. 40% of American adults don't have $400 in savings. There are obviously lots of, we could go down a rabbit hole and talk about all the levers and layers that cause that. But right now, that's sort of what we're left with, is just that fact. Pre-COVID, there was an estimated 1.5 million New Yorkers that rely on emergency food programs every year. And as you can imagine, that number has significantly increased as people have lost their jobs and have become more food insecure. So I think, is it David mentioned the food bank that you guys are funding in Brooklyn? Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Food banks are food pantries, food banks are a great way to meet that immediate need. And we highlighted Food Bank for New York City. It's a network of food banks all over New York City, but there are many neighborhood food banks. And I know you probably all live in different communities, not just in New York, but around the country. And there are reputable, great organizations in most of the communities that you're in, probably. So we like Food Bank. They're thinking about underserved specific neighborhoods and healthcare workers, but more so just the concept of thinking about food as one of our primary immediate needs. Next, I want to highlight maybe an untraditional issue that wouldn't come to top of mind in thinking about meeting immediate needs, but in normal non-COVID world, 1 in 4 women have experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner. And as you can imagine, this increases in times of stress, and even more so now that we're all sheltered in place, and lots of shelters for domestic violence have been shut down during this time. So we're highlighting 2 different types of organizations here. One is a network of shelters in New York, and one is an advocacy support organization. So Urban Resource Institute is the largest shelter system in New York and in the country. They are actually a research partner of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. URI has 20 shelters in New York and houses almost 2,200 people each night. And also there's a huge overlap between the homeless population and survivors of domestic violence. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is the national, free, anonymous, 24/7, 365 support hotline for survivors. The advocates on the other end of the line help survivors come up with a safety plan to escape abuse and connect with local resources. Because it's the national hotline, other organizations that are having to shut down because of COVID are forwarding their calls to the national hotline. So they're having a an influx of calls and having to hire more advocates, and at the same time train all of their advocates to work from home and provide mental health support and emotional health support for them now that they're at home. From March 16th to April 8th, they received over 2,600 calls from survivors citing COVID as a circumstance of their abuse. And 15% of those calls were from California, 10% from Texas, and 8% from New York. You can see some of the needs of both of these organizations on the right side of the slide. And then Ishita, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and one of the other immediate needs that we want to discuss, which we've already somewhat spoken about in terms of looking at your local hospitals, but one that we wanted to spotlight specifically is Montefiore Medical Center, which I'm sure if you live in New York, you've at least heard of. And they are situated in the Bronx, and we've had a partnership with them through this time of communication, especially for some of our other clients who want to provide some sort of funding support to New York City frontline workers. What we've been able to gather from their team is that the number of cases right now, the latest number we have is 2,000, but this is from a few days ago, so I'm sure that number has increased even more. They had 2,000 active cases, and the number of total beds they had for critical care was also 2,000, which means that if they have patients who need anything else that's not coronavirus related, there aren't enough beds for them. So they're in the process right now of converting their 2,000 bed hospital to an 8,000 bed satellite situation using facilities such as community centers and stadiums to really enhance the types of services that they can give and the number of physicians and staff that can provide. So a couple of different ways that we were able to help with Montefiore and are really looking to add to this is, one is that nurses and other frontline workers who live with elderly or children at home are unable to go back home at the end of the night. And of course, that means they also have to quarantine themselves for a couple weeks after. So what they're doing is renting out hotel rooms. They basically blocked off a full hotel specifically for Montefiore in the Bronx. And for every 10 frontline workers that can be supported for 4 weeks, that's about $30,000. That's about a $30,000 need that they have. They have over 100 frontline workers right now who are in need of having the support, the financial support to stay in hotels. And because Montefiore's immediate needs, along with other hospitals in New York as well, is really enhancing the number of beds that they have, they're unable to allocate those funds to the hotel stays. Other things we've seen, as you all probably know, is the needs that they have for food, bringing in catered food. So their staff that's tripled, quadrupled now has the food that they need. And they are also, of course, looking for support in terms of helping to get those number of hospital beds from 2,000 to 8,000. And of course, this is not the only hospital in New York that's in need, but what is very unique about Montefiore is that they serve a very low income population, and they are all over the Bronx. So it's not just one location, but they have many different locations where they're serving different communities within the Bronx.
Yeah, and to add to that, I don't think you said this, Ishita, but they're one of the top 5 institutions for COVID patients. So they're like center of the action. And frankly, because the communities that they're serving and a lot of the community that works at the hospital really is showing us sort of the healthcare disparity right in front of us. So the ability to be able to pay for some of those hotel rooms is a real privilege for some of those healthcare workers who are showing up. One other opportunity in immediate term, we've talked mostly about New York opportunities thus far, but we couldn't help but include a couple international opportunities throughout our conversation, as this type of crisis does disproportionately affect the poor of not just the country, but the world. Partners in Health is an organization. They work in 11 different countries, and they build high quality health systems in places where most people won't touch. Through having conversations with Partners in Health, I realized that social distancing is a privilege, which was a shift in perspective for me, that people who live in settings of food insecurity, or who live in slums, or who don't have help in the way of caregiving or safe burials in some countries, don't get the privilege of social distancing. Partners in Health was on the ground treating Ebola, so they already have systems in place, and really like a plug and play action plan for a global pandemic like this. They are seeing a shortage of PPE, personal protection equipment, like we have in the States. But as the COO said when I talked to him, we're really focused on COVID, but women are still having babies, and people are still getting treated for HIV, and all that work needs to continue. And all of the medical devices and protection gear that we normally use is really hard to find, because the whole world needs it right now for COVID. And the other thing that they're working on is transitioning all of their spaces into appropriate spaces for COVID patients. So for holding, screening, isolating patients, quarantining people who have been exposed. So they are raising an $18 million fund to expand their efforts in the 11 incredibly poor countries that they work in. And they are, as of April 7th, they were at a bit over 17 million. So they're doing well in the first round of fundraising for this, but just a really great organization I wanted to make sure to highlight. Cool, Ishita, do you want?
Yeah, and so now we'll go into some of our midterm solutions, so looking at that 10 to 90 day time frame. And so far, we've really provided options of how you can support on more of the individualized level, how we can offer relief and aid to individuals who are most at risk and at need. And looking more so into the midterm framing, we're spotlighting more so small businesses that are maybe not within your immediate network, and are more so looking at a more scalable, or even within New York City or the tri-state area, looking at organizations that maybe you don't know, but you still want to lend to or offer philanthropic dollars to. And so I'll start this part with talking about the community development financial institutions in the US. So these are financial institutions that are more grassroots and really offering not just low cost loans and other types of funding, but also offering technical assistance and much more of a closer relationship with the borrowers. So the role of a CDFI, unlike say a bank, is really meeting the people who are unable to get general institutional access to capital, meaning they don't have collateral, or they don't have credit history, and they are looking for loans to start a small business, such as opening up a hair parlor, or a small restaurant that's local. It could be for a number of different things, but that are generally to prop up a new business for the community. And CDFIs really look at not just if this borrower or person is able to repay or have a successful business, but more so, how is this going to benefit the community? Is this aligned with the mission of creating a better quality life for this area? And what I should also mention is that CDFIs, they look specifically at areas that are low income. So about 80% of the borrowers are low income. Over 50% are of color. And CDFIs have really propped up in areas that are either rural or just generally of an impoverished population. And so the entire concept is really to look at this full community. How can we lift not just individuals, but the overall area? And so what we see is many CDFIs throughout the US and also organizations that are very similar to CDFIs working internationally, and looking at these specific organizations to really help small businesses, not just financially, but also with technical assistance. And that means going to them and saying like, okay, what are the specific needs that you have? How can we maybe like think of repurposing your business or figure out a way that you can help your staff gain other employment in this time? So it's really going way beyond just providing the financial assistance and really offering a little bit more mentorship, because CDFIs are all in their local context. They understand the communities that they're serving and are able to speak to that. So what we have here is 5 different options of organizations that work with small businesses. The first 3 are CDFIs themselves. And the last 2 are organizations that work with social enterprises internationally, but really act as CDFIs. CDFIs is more so a term that we use for the US itself. And while New York City itself has over, I think like 40 different CDFIs, the ones that we list off here are not to a very specific region, but are more broadly for domestic and international.
They're also all specifically doing COVID funds.
Yeah. And so I won't go into a crazy amount of detail on each of them, but what I'll do is point out some unique features for all 5 of these. So the first is C-Note, and C-Note is different than the others, as anyone without having like a minimum amount necessarily can really put a low cost loan, as in fund C-Note, fund people, small businesses, and you could do it for as little as $100 and help businesses who are struggling with coronavirus relief needs. And it would be in the term of like, say, 1 year or 2 years. And then after that time, you would receive your money back. And the need there is really, they just need some cash to bridge some needs for their staff or rent or other business operations. And then the remaining 4 are all for coronavirus relief needs for businesses that are looking to either repurpose their businesses, or they have an increased amount of demand, but don't have the cash to maybe provide the supplies immediately. And so I can offer a couple examples that could help people understand what some of this like repurposing of businesses could look like. So one example is an organization that is shifting its operations from a distillery to using that equipment and those facilities to create and sell hand sanitizer. So they're basically using the facility that they have, creating new distribution channels, but they need a cash influx to do that. And so that is in the form of a low cost loan. And so organizations like Low Income Investment Fund and Opportunity Fund are able to find those small businesses and work with them to help them repurpose and launch. Another example I have of this through Opportunity Fund is a woman who was selling tamales to her local community, and she had a shop. And now Opportunity Fund is helping her recreate what she actually had as a brick and mortar shop into a more food truck type of a service model, where she can go from community to community so people can better access the food that she has. And so the first 3 that we have here are domestic, and then the last 2 are serving markets in Africa and Latin America, and Acumen is also doing parts of India. And what these two organizations do is also serving small businesses that are already part of their portfolio, and helping them with their coronavirus relief needs as well. And one of the reasons that we are looking to partner and fund these 5 intermediary organizations is because they already have really strong relationships with these borrowers. These borrowers have proven results over the course of many years, and they have a strong relationship with the organizations. And since many of our clients don't necessarily know hundreds of small businesses themselves, but really want to offer that support, we work with these intermediaries and see these as a great way to extend the support to the small businesses that need it and have a solid track record. Ali, anything you want to add to that?
Just a couple things. I know we're starting to push on our time limit, but Ishita, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last 2 opportunities on this page are grants. The bottom one is a recoverable grant, Acumen is a grant, and then the top 3 are investment opportunities with different term lengths and different expected return profiles.
Yes, that is correct.
There are more details on all of them in the subsequent slides that we'll send to you guys. And the T Fund is not actually called T Fund. So if that's something that particularly interests you, then reach out to us individually, and we can talk about making that connection. It was just like we needed to keep more anonymous.
And the only other thing I'll add to that, and thanks for pointing that out, Ali, that the last 2 are grants, is one of the reasons that Acumen and T-Fund are grants is that for the emerging markets, coronavirus is still a little behind in terms of the consequences that will occur there. And so since they see that as more risky, they've decided to create grants for those areas instead of low-cost loans. Whereas more so on the domestic space, we at least have like a better understanding of what the range of consequences looks like within the United States for small businesses.
Yeah. Awesome. The last thing I'll touch on before we close and open for questions is we did include a Beyond the Dollar slide. So you guys gave some great creative opportunities of how to contribute in ways that are not financial in nature. And here's some other ideas, which I'll let you peruse on your own. And then in the appendix, we left you a list of questions for existing grantees. These are some of the questions that we're asking our clients' existing grantees to understand their needs in this moment, and resources for small businesses and additional giving opportunities. Cool. And then on this page, you have both of our information if you have any individual questions or want to talk more in depth about any of the things that we talked about today. So thank you guys so much. Thanks for hosting us.
Ali and Ishita, thank you. This is fantastic, and I know probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you guys have to offer, but it's certainly, for me, helping to kind of stimulate some different thinking. And I'd love to open the floor for a few questions. And again, just want to remind you, if you don't have a chance, you have a very detailed question, maybe throw that in the chat. We'll make sure that Ali and Ishita get it, and we'll send it back out via email. Jeff, will you pray for us?
Sure, I'm glad to. Again, and like Tim said, thank you everybody, and look forward to this conversation continuing. If we could pray and close it out for the day. Dear Lord, we come to you individually and as a community, as a group, to thank you for your love, your sovereignty, your generosity. We learn generosity because you were generous to us. You sent your son for us, and as a predictable, sinful culture that we are on today, Good Friday, we crucified him. We seem to have that nature to react poorly when our normal is threatened. He came as truth and light, and we reacted and you redeemed that. Now, as we're threatened again by a virus fallout, economic fallout, that instead we act with love and generosity as you love us, forgive us, and created a generous spirit in us. Please take our fears and anxiety caused by COVID and replace them with trust in your will. All that we have is yours, and I pray that we steward it well through this time and moving forward. In your son's precious name we pray. Amen.